Hello, hello, my friends, my fellow insurance agents, risk managers. Dr. E here. I hope you can see me. I bought this light, this special light to shine on my pretty face. Maybe that you can see the shine off of my head. I know I can barely see myself in the picture there, and I really want to stay out of the picture so that I don't block any of the important words. So let's get started with Chapter 3 on risk management. Okay? So risk management is a process that identifies loss exposures faced by an organization or by a family, and it selects the most appropriate techniques for treating such exposures. So risk management is a planning process. And in the last 25 years, risk management has become much more recognized and appreciated as an important part of managing a business, an organization, a family, and a life. Planning. So a risk management program identifies loss exposures in advance and helps a firm or a family to lower risk, lower costs, and lower anxiety, and that's really important. All three of those things. Lower your risk, lower your cost, the cost of risk, and lower your anxiety. Increase your comfort level, help you sleep at night. All right, so a loss exposure is any situation in which a loss is possible. We went over that in Chapter 2, maybe in Chapter 1. One thing I've noticed about this book is that they repeat concepts several times, and I guess it's just to reinforce those ideas. So we know what a loss exposure is. It is a potential situation or source of a loss. And examples that might include if you're operating a plant and you could have an environmental problem with the plant. Or if you're in an automobile or operating an automobile, that automobile might become damaged in a collision. Or if you are running a company and you're not careful with your hiring practices and your human resources practices, you could unwittingly be sued by an employee for violating age discrimination laws. So you've got to be aware of all these sources of a possible loss. All right, so what is the objectives of risk management? Well, there are objectives that are before, pre-loss objectives, and post-loss objectives. So pre-loss objectives involve preparing for potential losses in the most economical way. You know you're going to have losses. You have to identify what types of losses, what situations are involved in these losses, and how can you best treat those losses. And in this case, for example, you can have insurance or you can retain the losses, which means you're self-insuring, you pay for it yourself. All right, reduce anxiety. Let's make sure at least the big exposures are covered. And of course, you want to meet any legal obligations that you're supposed to have, like safety equipment and product labeling. So pre-loss objectives are to make sure that you meet these standards up front. You don't want to get caught after the fact. All right, post-loss objectives. What happens after a loss? Well, you want the firm to survive. You want earnings to continue to be solid. You want to be able to continue to grow your firm, and you want to minimize the effects that a loss will have on other people and on society, and like other people, like employees. Okay, how will employees be affected? Okay, how will customers be affected? How will creditors or lenders who have loaned money to the business be affected? And how will the community be affected? And we are seeing the effects of the unrest in our cities. I'm doing this video in 2020, and we're seeing a lot of unrest, and we are seeing a big impact on communities and on banks and on customers and on residents and on employees from the COVID and from the unrest and all of the unemployment and all of the destruction and lack of security, causing lots of problems. All right, so first we're going to identify potential losses. Then we're going to measure and analyze those loss exposures, try to quantify those losses. And then we're going to look at the techniques that are available to treat those losses. And then we will implement and monitor the program. Okay, so we are going to walk through this process, this risk management process, and we're going to write all this planning out, and then we're going to implement the program, and then we're going to monitor and stay on top of the program and make any changes that need to be made as we learn things. All right, so let's identify some common loss exposures for business. Okay, so you have tangible and intangible property loss exposures, okay, such as buildings, equipment, supplies, data, and the firm's public relations or image. These are all items that could be damaged, and so as a risk manager, you have to be aware of and inspect and think about and measure all of these areas. Okay, liability loss exposures, defective products, environmental, HR, such as hiring and firing, and age discrimination and sexual harassment, and then your directors, your officers and directors have to be protected from liability, and also maybe professional liability like malpractice. Okay, business income loss exposures. So if there is property damage or the death of a key employee, you might have the cost of loss. You might have the cost of the business being disrupted. You might have added expenses involved with trying to operate your business from another location and using having to purchase new equipment, things like that. Okay, so these are common loss exposures for business. Human resource loss exposures, as I mentioned, loss of key employees. You know, what happens if the president of the company is incapacitated or dies? The loss of benefits, that if you lose your job, you lose your benefits. A possible disability that could happen, where you're unable to work for a while. Okay, crime loss exposures include robberies, fraud committed by somebody in the organization, and hacking, where criminals get into your information system and either corrupt your information system and or they steal your intellectual property. They steal your copyrights and your patents. All right, foreign losses. When you're doing international business, you could have trouble from terrorism, or terrorists kidnap key employees or blow up your buildings, destroy your buildings. You could run into legal issues because the laws are so different, and then you could run into political issues where governments come in and just take control of your property. Okay, so if you're doing business internationally, you're going to need a risk manager to identify these troublesome areas and figure out how to mitigate them. All right, governmental losses include laws that are out there and regulations that are out there that you have to be aware of, and most businesses these days have a ton of regulations that have to be followed, and I think that regulations are well intended for the most part, but unfortunately the putting regulations into practice is much more difficult than it is in theory. When you write something down on a piece of paper, it sounds like that it could be pretty helpful, but when you try to put it into practice, it could be very impractical. It could really increase the cost of doing business, and it could very much decrease the efficiency that you have in your company. All right. There are sources of information to identify loss exposures. Most risk managers use questionnaires and checklists. They submit these questionnaires and checklists to key employees who understand their various areas, so that the employees can sit down and systematically go through and identify what it is that the company's doing in their area and what the potential risk exposures could be. And then you, as a risk manager, you go in and you physically inspect the operation. Okay, the financial statements can indicate where the big costs are and where the financial risks are. Okay, you typically, companies that have a history, either their own history or the history of the industry in which they operate, there's a lot of data out there that can tell you where the problem spots are for a company that's operating in either in a certain geographical area, or in a certain type of industry. Industry trends and market changes can create new loss exposures. So on the one hand, we're looking at history, and that helps us a lot, but we have to be aware of things that change. Okay, and examples include terrorism. That, for example, prior to 9/11, we didn't think anything about terrorism. All right, and in the last 15, 20 years, as we've become more reliant on the internet and on electronic information systems, we've become much more vulnerable to electronic terrorism. Okay, and then as we have found in just the last 4 or 5 months, since the beginning of the year, we are vulnerable to citizen unrest. And as of this point, our country hasn't come together to decide how we're going to handle that. All right, so you have to look at each loss exposure and estimate each loss exposure. And so there are two dimensions to estimating loss exposure. One is frequency. Okay, and frequency refers to the probable number of losses that may occur over a certain time period, usually a year. Okay, how many losses, how many incidents do we expect to have? And then severity refers to the probable size of each loss that happens. So you know that the number of losses times the size of each loss equals the total amount of the loss for the year. Okay, and so you might go through and rank the exposures or the sources of risk by their frequency and by their size, and so that you can make sure that you prioritize and take care of the most expensive and dangerous losses first. Okay, and in general, in the insurance industry, loss severity is considered to be more important than loss frequency, and so we look at two types of severity. One is the maximum possible loss, which is the worst loss that could happen to the firm during its lifetime. So as you look at an operation, you try to envision a worst case scenario, and then there's the probable maximum loss, which is not necessarily the worst loss that could happen, but the worst loss that might happen. So if you think there's a 1% chance of some type of catastrophic loss, you probably won't spend that much time looking at it. But if you think there's a 10% chance of a significant loss, then you're probably going to tackle that problem first. All right? All right, so how do you treat loss exposures? Well, you select the most appropriate way, and that involves risk control. risk control, and these are techniques that reduce the frequency and the severity of losses. And methods of risk control include avoidance, loss prevention, and loss reduction. So avoidance means a specified loss exposure is never undertaken. You understand the loss that could happen, and you make the decision that you are not going to involve yourself in a hazard that could exacerbate a peril. You're going to stay away from it completely, okay? And if you're doing something that you're already involved in something, you make the decision to stop doing it. All right? So the chance of loss is reduced to 0. But it's not always practical or possible to avoid all losses. For example, if your primary business activity involves a hazard, like driving large trucks to transport items, you cannot stop your business simply to avoid losses. If you're making a profit and a cost of doing business is losses, accidents, theft, okay, but you are still profitable after paying for accidents and theft, then risk avoidance is not the way you're going to treat this. All right, loss prevention refers to measures that reduces the frequency of a particular loss. Okay, what can we do to cut down on the number of losses? An example would be installing safety features on hazardous products. If you go to Lowe's to have a piece of lumber cut, then the person who cuts it, first of all, you have to stand, as the customer, you have to stand a good distance away from the saw, and the person who is using the saw wears gloves, wears goggles, puts earbuds in. There is a safety guard that goes over the blade. The blade has to be turned on, and there is a safety control that if the blade catches, it will automatically shut down. So these are all safety precautions that are intended to reduce the number of problems with this product. You might also put like a speed governor on a truck, okay, where the truck cannot go faster than a certain top speed. Or you might put a sensor on a truck or a car that alerts you when you are swerving. So if you're starting to get sleepy, the newer cars have this, the trucks have this. If you start to swerve lanes, then a sound and a vibration goes off that will tell you, stay in your lane, bro. All right, loss reduction refers to measures that reduce the severity of a loss after it occurs, and an example would be like installing an automatic sprinkler system in a building. So if a building catches fire and the sprinkler system is triggered and the sprinkler system is adequate, then that sprinkler system will cut down on the loss that is caused by the fire. Also, you might have airbags placed in the cabin of a truck so that if an accident happens, the life and the health of a driver and or a passenger might be protected. Okay, so these are examples of loss reduction. All right, so you're going to have to know the difference between prevention and reduction. Okay, so pay attention. If your eyes are starting to get a little droopy, slap yourself around a little bit, you know, and we only have 3 more slides to go in this clip. All right, techniques for treating the loss exposures. Well, risk financing. These are techniques that provide for the payment of losses after they happen. So once we identify loss exposures, once we take measures to avoid loss, to reduce the frequency and to reduce the severity, now we're dealing with what happens when a loss occurs. What's the best way to pay for it? Okay? And the methods of financing include retention. We've covered this in the previous chapter. Non-insurance transfers like warranties and contracts, service contracts, and commercial insurance. And this is for business. Okay? So with retention, that means that the firm will pay part or all of the losses that result from a given exposure. So a firm recognizes the exposure is there, has taken measures to reduce it, the number and the severity, and is willing to pay for any losses out of their pocket. Okay, and retention is used when there's not a better method of treating a loss than you simply retain it. Okay, if the worst possible loss is not that bad, then retention is acceptable. If losses are highly predictable, then you know when they're going to happen, you know how much they're going to cost, and so that helps you retain for the loss. And then if the retention level is the dollar amount of losses that the firm will retain. And so the firm establishes how much in total they can afford to pay out, and that's what they retain. Anything that goes above that, then they're going to have to find a different way of treating the loss. Okay, so you set a limit on how much retention you can have. So there are several methods to pay for retained losses. Okay, out of current income. Okay, and so you treat your losses as current as expenses. So generally speaking, like an allowance for a doubtful account, after a while, after a history or a period where you're running your business, you get a sense of what the cost of your losses will be each year, and you just keep that in the bank to pay for it. Okay, and you have unfunded reserves where you set up for accounting purposes an allowance for losses. And then you have a funded reserve where you actually keep funds on hand. It's not just an accounting entry, but you actually separate funds out and keep them available to pay losses. And then you might establish a credit line, okay, which is when you go to the bank and borrow money in the event that you have losses. So you might have a line of credit outstanding where you're not drawing any money out until the loss happens. Then you go to the bank and you draw the money out, and you agree to a schedule of repayment after you have borrowed the money. All right, so these are the methods used to fund retained losses. All right, we're halfway through this chapter 3, and so we're going to take a quick break, and homework 1 for chapter 3 is covers slides 1 through 15, and then we're going to continue on to slide 16 in the next clip. Until then, stand up, do some calisthenics. Oh man, water, oxygen. I think I pulled a hammy. All right, old Dr. E. Let me see if I can button my coat. I can button my coat. Oh, plenty of room to spare. Just from doing those calisthenics, I'm in good shape. I'll be back in just a few. Get up and splash your face with some cold water. Jump around and breathe in some helium, and we'll talk. Peace out. Shalom.